stay forever if I could.
So don't be alarmed, but do help us all remember to leave the microphone. Okay, this panel is entitled Intersections, and our panelists, starting at the end, are Smaro Cambarelli, Misha Bugasgosman.
So close.
So sorry.
I could see it turn in the corner.
Sitting up here with these eloquent people, and Laurie Turnbull. And what I want to do to start our panel today is to begin by offering to speak to the topics of the conference, right? So we, as conference organizers, decided together that we would offer all of the panelists moments to situate themselves within either the expansiveness or the constraints of the terms of the conference that we've set. And so I'll invite Smaro to begin the conversation, then Misha, and then Laurie, and we'll move on from there. And like Smaro, I'll cut things off from my direction and open them up to the audience partway through.
Well, I'd like to start by saying it's a delight to be here and an honor, but if I were to talk about the topics of the conference, I could only do that at the risk of repeating of what has already been said, especially when Mary was talking in the earlier panel. I thought you should, need a lawyer because you stole all my lines. And what I mean by that is I want to start with a disclaimer. I do not think of myself as a public intellectual. In fact, I think that the notion of the public intellectual is not something that goes through a process of self-appellation. I do not say, hi, I'm Smaro, I'm a public intellectual. And that speaks volumes. I think it speaks volumes, and it goes back to the question Lorna asked. I think, and I don't think that there was enough time to engage with that in the previous panel. I come from a tradition where to be an intellectual is an honor. To be an academic is an honor. Here in Canada, to be an academic often is accompanied by a sense of stigma or a taint. You have to always apologize for being a scholar, for loving knowledge, for teaching students. And so with that kind of caveat out of the way, I will say that, yes, the notion of the public intellectual is extremely problematic. I published an essay a couple of years ago in which I examined the genealogy of the concept, and it was interesting to me to find out that in North America, the notion of the public intellectual entered public discourse, i.e. media discourse, only in the late 60s, which I think speaks volumes to how the notion of intellectual language or conversation is featured in North America. But I'm more inclined to think of the intersections, which is the title of our panel. For me, the most important intersection is when what we may call, within scare codes, the public intellectual and the cultural activist. And my main problem is with the notion of the public. And I hope we have the chance to talk about that. I think I have a problem hearing people talk about the public as if we know what it is, as if it's an us and them kind of paradigm situation, the Tim Hortons public. I don't know. I go to Tim Hortons, maybe Janice doesn't. I don't know. And also the notion of the public sphere. I think my notion of public space these days is that there is no such thing as public space. It's managed, it's policed, it's regulated, sometimes in the name of safety or security, but we have lost, I think, a fundamental aspect of what public entails. And I hope if there is one thing that women intellectuals will help to reclaim that publicness of the space back.
I, unlike Smara, consider myself an intellectual. That being said, I know nothing. And I consider it a part of my job as a classical singer, as a quasi-archivist, to assemble as much knowledge, as much context as I possibly can, and then have all of that knowledge and all of that context spout forth through the repertoire that I sing, hopefully making it real for my audience, who is my public. Now, I also deal in music that is predominantly within public domain. So there's no copyright. I can simply go to the library, look up anything pre-50 years ago, and claim it as my own, and never have to pay any royalties. Now that I have come to an intersection in my life where I'm starting to write more, starting to arrange more, I understand where the real money is. And I take that role, this transitory, intersectory role, very seriously, although I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea how my public's going to change. I have no idea how the spaces I perform in are going to change. I have no idea how people's reaction to the choices that I have made or are about to make will change, and none of that concerns me because I think it's very important to run your own race and create your own space into which people will come and gravitate towards you. And I also feel that in terms of the discourse and the dialogues that we're creating, in an atmosphere in an arena such as this, allow us to expand on whatever we conceive of as public space and as a philosophy of thought. And I know we're all on borrowed time, so I'm just kind of trying to expand my space as much as I possibly can.
Thank you. Lori?
Thank you. I'm going to echo a little bit about what has been said so far. I'm not terribly comfortable either with the term public intellectual if it ever seems to be applied to me. And I did a radio show with Michael Enright on the concept of a public intellectual, particularly in the academy. And Stephen Clarkson was the other guest on the show. And even though it was a really interesting conversation, the more the conversation evolved, the less comfortable I was being part of a conversation about public intellectuals because I wasn't sure that I really belonged there. But I think of myself more, especially in the context of the work I do, as a person with a responsibility to be a public citizen. And so my work is on parliament, it's on government, it's on whether or not the government is doing the right thing, what it means for the government to do the right thing. I think we're living in an era where it's very much the norm for people who speak to us through the media are sometimes trying to be confusing. And so what I try to do is to be clear about what we should be able to expect from government, what our responsibilities are as citizens. And so I absolutely agree that to be a part of the academy is a very privileged position. I think it's, to be able to spend my time thinking and writing and talking is a wonderful, wonderful privilege. And part of that exchange is that I have a responsibility. It's a kind of an ethic, this is the way I think about it, to have a public, and that's not just my students that who actually come to my class. I like to talk to as many people as who want to listen to me about what democracy means, what good government means. And so that's kind of the way I think of the conference theme as it applies to my own work.
Thank you so much. I want to build on some of the problematizing ways that we're picking up on two of these key terms. They're not the only ones, but I keep hearing publics and intellectuals come up. So I want to take the opportunity to stay there for a few moments. And of course, the term publics has all kinds of different resonances. Michael Warner, who does locate himself in a university space, his descriptions of both publics and what he calls counter-publics has quite a great deal of resonance. People have particularly taken up, he's got broad appeal in these terms, and he describes publics as being dependent on the conversations, he says discourses, that address them. And he says that a public is a relation among strangers, and each of you on this panel, it seems to me, partly because we titled the panel Intersections, works across an intersection or a variety of publics, from the diasporic to the international, to the local, the national, the listening public. Each of you also works within institutional spaces and moving across different institutional spaces, often seen as hyper-public, owned by the public in the case of the CBC, perhaps. And so I'd like to push this a little bit forward by asking you to take a few moments each to locate yourselves a little bit further. And you've done this to start, but I'd like to ask you to take a moment to think about and think with us about who you identify as your listeners, your publics, your audiences, the fellow citizens to whom you feel responsible, to pick up on a term that Lori used. Do you have audiences or listeners, publics, citizenships in mind? And to what extent are they a part of the kinds of conversations that you have on your own or in deliberately public spaces? And perhaps we'll go this way and start with Lori.
Okay. That's a difficult question because sometimes you never really know who your public is. In an immediate sense, when you teach at a university, your public consists of your classes, your students, and you have a particular way of relating to your students because you're working within a curriculum, you're working within a sort of a setting where they expect certain things from you, and you're relating to them in certain ways. You're giving a lot of feedback, hopefully lots of positive feedback. You're teaching a particular, skill set or chunk of information. And so you're mindful of what they are entitled to or what they should be able to learn from the class. You're kind of cognizant of where they're going, and you're trying to provide as much support as you can for them to do what they're going to do. And then beyond that, when I'm addressing a wider, if I'm writing for a paper or on the radio and I'm thinking, the audience is larger than and it's harder to predict, I'm mindful of practitioners, increasingly so, because I had someone tell me once that it's very difficult for government to incorporate academic advice because academics don't understand very well the assumptions that government is working with. And so I really took that to heart, and I thought, well, I don't want to be wrong all the time. And even if I'm trying my best and doing good work in an intellectual sense, I don't want practitioners to look at it and think, she just doesn't get it. That's a nice idea, but that's not how the world works. And so increasingly, I'm trying to be focused on, not exclusively and not too much because that's bad too, but I'm trying to kind of process how the things I say would be interpreted by somebody who works directly in the field. How would a deputy minister, how would an MP, how would a senator respond to what I'm saying? Not to get that to drive my result, but for it to inform my perspective. And beyond that, I just sort of hope that people who are interested in democracy and voting and elections and politics are listening. Yeah.
Thank you.
For me, I think it would seem obvious who my public is. It's essentially whoever shells out the cash for a ticket and is finding their bums in the seats in front of me. But I think, especially with the incarnation of social media and being able to control your own PR through Twitter and other avenues, you can essentially present to the public a truth that often isn't reflected in media. I don't think it's as bad in the United States as it is, I know it's not as bad in Canada as it is in the United States and Britain and France and South America. However, I do feel like we, as classical artists, have sometimes this built-in intellectualism that is attributed to us simply by virtue of the fact that we seem like we're engaging in this super high art, and I can tell you that we are not high artists. We're simply humans attempting to recreate something and preserve something that we feel very strongly about. Or we just want to make money and happen to have spent all of our lives in a practice room and are now finally let out of the cage. So it all depends on how you view what your life will be. I started lessons when I was 7 and always knew that this is what I would be. And at this point in my life, sitting on stage and talking instead of singing is a very new experience for me. It's nice to not have to warm up.
Anytime.
It's hilarious. My favorite, then there's the public who thinks that singing just happens. And thinks that because you've shown up and the voice exists in the throat, that you can just somehow magically start singing exactly how you would. But there's an issue of pride at stake. There's an issue of process, there's an issue of methodology, there's an issue of respect for how hard you've worked and what it takes to present what it is that seems pristine once you've bought the ticket.
Fair enough.
No, but in all seriousness, we work to create a public. In my opinion, I think the role of the classical musician is to create a public who is both made to feel welcome and not made to feel intimidated by the experience that they're engaging in. That music is music, and I'm not saying that you have to add a backbeat or dumb it down or shorten a symphony to cater to an audience. I think that you have to make yourself more accessible. You have to be willing to write program notes that people can read. I don't mean the average person, I mean that people can read, that I can read. I'm not interested in reading a historical treatise when I open a program for a concert. What I want to know is why this is good and what I'm looking for in terms of how to enjoy things. And when you look at something like Beethoven's Eroica, I don't know what Eroica means. I want somebody to tell me what that is. I want to know how long it's going to be and why it's divided into symphonic form and why symphonic form is symphonic form and why Beethoven is important to symphonic form and how we changed it and what that means for me. And then we look at a Kanye West song and realize that he's using Beethoven's form. But that's for me to know. That doesn't really matter. That's something that matters to me. It's something that I would like to share with people so that they understand that there's not that big of a divide between us. So I guess the public that I'm interested in engaging with and that I would love to have attract to me is one who does not see a divide between us. I don't want to be approached and mauled, but I certainly don't want to be viewed as somebody who isn't generous with the information, who isn't willing to lift the curtain and tell you exactly what the process is, because it's not a secret. It is embarked upon by few, but it's not a secret. And it's a lot of hard work for sure, but what isn't, that is good. So I guess that I've kind of lost the thread, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the intersection of classical music with the public, like the church, sometimes leaves people feeling judged instead of welcomed. And I try to bridge that gap in both areas.
I don't think you lost the thread, I mean, especially in terms of locating yourself and your work and thinking about these terms.
This is not easy, people. Go ahead, Samara.
I guess for me, there are two kinds of publics in the context of your question, the real public and what I might call the aspirational public, the public I would wish to reach. So the real public is the public you talked about, my students. It begins and ends with them. I love teaching, I care for them. The older I get, the more I enjoy their youthfulness. They educate me about a lot of things. But I had a very strange experience twice during the course of my, when I was a Canada Research Chair. You have to submit an annual report, which has a lot to do with impact and the kinds of audiences you reach out. And so I filled in this area about the public. I said, my students. They turned it back from the research office. That was not acceptable. Like, the students did not qualify as the public. And I removed a couple of sentences. I compromised. But the second year, I wrote a little manifesto. Because the students, for me, are not just my students. They have lovers, friends, parents, grandparents. And I cannot begin to tell you how many times a student would come, either after class or even a few years after the course was delivered, to tell me about how what she or he learned, which he shared with their family. Their grandparents said, oh my goodness, yes, I knew that, or all kinds of connections that reverberate from that kind of captive audience, if you want. But yes, of course, I would like to have a bigger audience, but I'm a realist. But I want to give you briefly two examples of a very different, non-student kind of audience that I had within the same semester a few years back. I was invited to give a talk in a series called Breakfast on the Hill that's organized by the, I don't know if they still do it, the Canadian Federation for the Humanities. Your audience is a wonderful audience. You can get someone who walks into Parliament, or you can have, I had senators, ministers, the president of SHRC was there, so it's a very different occasion. I had to use the kind of language that would be appropriate. I had fun doing it, and I loved it. I enjoyed it. It was a performative moment. And then a week or so later, on a rainy day like here today, I went to address an elementary school where my nephew was a student. In the gym, there were this, I don't know how old they would have been, 7, 8 years old. And they asked my nephew to introduce me. And he said, all the gifts she gives me are books. She travels a lot. And if you want to know more about her, you can read it on Wikipedia. That was the first time I heard I was on Wikipedia. But I talked to them about poetry. I played some Bippy Nicol tapes. I danced with them. They thought I was cool. And then I got questions, how much do you make? How old are you? And so it was a very different experience, but I loved it. And I did get a gift card for Tim Hortons.
Fantastic. Very good. So good.
Those are wonderful stories. I want to continue on this line of thought, and that is to ask you, now that you've located yourself in your work and the ways in which you think about, you're starting to think about your work in relation to various publics, whether or not you have concerns or have experienced perhaps issues about the publics, I'm going to stick with that term, problematized as it may be, whether or not you've got concerns or issues about the publics you may or may not be able to reach with your work. One of the ways that you might attend to this question, you may not, is to think about the ways in which your work, the labor to which you dedicate your lives, is disseminated. Social media, radio, printed publications, television, live talks, these sorts of things. Are there concerns around disseminations and whether or not your work is reaching out? In some ways, I think this is akin to the question posed on the first panel around the spaces for public discussions. It's not quite the same question, but it's in that arena, I think.
That's a very interesting question. I'm not sure how to engage with it. I think when I hear the word, maybe I'm recasting your question, and I apologize for that in advance if that's what I'm doing. But when I hear the phrase or the question, as we heard it earlier, what does the public want? The first thing that comes to mind is Sigmund Freud's question, what does woman want? So for me, that becomes immediately a Freud concept. And so the public for me is not amorphous. I've had different experiences with different kinds of communities. I prefer the word community to public. I feel more comfortable with the word community. When I first came to Canada, I was extremely involved. That's how I became, I guess, acculturated or Canadianized with the writers' community in Manitoba. I worked with writers, with Arts Council administrators who demonstrated in the middle of a heavy winter to have Margaret Lawrence taught at high schools in Manitoba. That was, an engagement with different constituencies. And later on, I became, as you kind of grow into the profession, I find that I have lost some of my contacts, if you want, or the time, not the desire or the possibility, the time to engage more directly with different communities. So my communities tend to be writers and cultural activists who believe in anti-racist work, who believe in the importance of Canadian literature, the importance of creating space for Canadian voices. And I'm involved in different communities at that level, but not to the extent that I would like to, so I say that with a great sense of regret. But frankly, the university has this incredible ability to consume your life, and I find I always need to prioritize my interests, but I always fail to do it in a way that I would find healthy.
Well, classical music is, at its core, an international pursuit, and the classical music industry is often connected through orchestras. When I tour, I'll go from orchestra to orchestra because I'm predominantly I'm a recitalist and a concert singer, as opposed to an opera singer where I'd be camped in one place for 6 weeks at a time. I'll usually change cities, countries, and orchestras week by week. And the publics And the audiences, as I would conceive of them, would be very different in each space. And the reaction to the repertoire and your programming of said repertoire is a direct, I feel, reflection of how much you not only respect but know the culture into which you are entering. And you don't program a lot of French music in Germany the same way you don't program a lot of English music in France. You simply look to the public to know what it is they'll respond to and hope that you've met them halfway while also entertaining them with a dose of education. Because I also am subjected to review almost every time, but luckily I don't read reviews, I don't watch YouTube, I have never Googled myself unless I was looking for those 2 pictures that I put up on the thing last night. And I am mostly concerned with the faces that I see on the night that I'm seeing them. But I'm very unsentimental about the audience, about the public. I'm not in any way emotionally connected to the fact that I am the center of attention. I create an atmosphere of inclusiveness, but then it's done. I don't long for that spotlight. I don't wish for that applause. I simply understand that it's people's way of expressing how they feel about what it is I've done. And I feel like, you know, the Norwegian audiences versus the Venezuelan audiences versus the Canadian audiences versus, you know, the French audiences, no two have reacted the same to the same repertoire. I did the premiere of Beethoven 9 in Ghana. They had never heard Beethoven's 9th Symphony in Ghana, and it's, you know, it's over 200 years old. And that was probably the most unique experience of a public being completely transformed by something I did, only because they never conceived of sound in that way. And I felt like I had understood for the first time the impact that we, as a collective, because it's 4 soloists, a whole choir, was the orchestra from La Scala, and I mean, it's a group effort. It wasn't just me. But we were all brought into context at that moment. And I think that classical musicians would do themselves a service by understanding that they are very much a tiny spoke in a very large wheel. And at this point, I am interested in the space that is created where people understand an artist and the repertoire is behind them, as opposed to only being a vessel through which the repertoire flows. I don't think I would naturally fit into that role anyway. So when I think of the international nature of classical music, I think of how I fit into all of those different cultures, into all of those different languages. Asia is much harder for me than Europe is. There's no anonymity for me in Asia. Look at me. I'm taller than everybody else. I'm darker than everybody else. My hair is bigger than everybody else. It's exhausting. But when I go to Paris, I can simply blend. So I become public. And I go to work and become specific. So it's an ongoing thing. It's an ongoing thing. It's ever-changing.
Thank you. I'm thinking about this concept of publics and as opposed to perhaps communities. And I'm thinking of the different kinds of publics and communities and groups that I've interacted with. And depending on who it is, the interaction is different and takes on a different form and might be more back and forth. But there is always that interaction, and you're always creating something with the people that you're speaking to or writing to or whatever it is. And so if I'm thinking, for instance, of being in a classroom, my classrooms are based on dialogue. I don't really like to kind of, talk at people for an hour and a half. Like, I like to build in as much back and forth as I can. And in my experience, students really will respond well to that if you create conditions where they feel safe and happy and they're interested in the material and you're interested in what they have to say. And so you get a lot of energy from that because you get their ideas, and then you're much better off because you never thought of it that way before. And so it's a constant educational experience for me to teach, because I always come away from a class thinking, I've never thought of it that way before. I have to make a note to myself. And so it never stops. And I'm also thinking of when I used to do more work, and now I really regret that I seem not to do this as much anymore, but I used to do more work at the local level with groups who wanted specific changes like electoral reform, things like that, and why don't we have those things? And it's not so much that I got involved as an activist, but just as someone to give them some information, because they thought, okay, well, you're a political scientist and you know about this, so why don't you come and tell us about the various options for changing the electoral system, and then that helps guide our activism. And that was really neat, because these groups were very focused on what they wanted, and they could see the utility in what I knew, and then I felt kind of useful, because I thought, well, even if they don't kind of get to where they want in terms of the change they want in particular, and that's a difficult change, but I thought, there was something transformative and positive about the conversations that we had. And then if you think larger than that, if you're on a radio show. Now, this is a recent example for me. CBC asked me to do a show talking about Kim Campbell's idea of creating dual constituencies, so one man, one woman for each constituency. And so this was pretty shortly after she raised this idea at a conference in Charlottetown, and they invited two of us to be sort of on the phone for an hour while they took calls from listeners. One interesting thing was about half of the callers were in favor of the idea, the other half weren't, so this kind of confirmed my notion that this is a very polarizing idea, whether it's a good one or a bad one. And about 8 out of 10 people who called in were men. But the way that CBC framed the question and the way they asked me questions, it was very, very open and very, open to me filling in as much information as I could. The questions, they tried as hard as they could not to assume anything, and they wanted most of the information to come from me when they asked me questions, rather than ask me what we might call a loaded question. The next day, I had the same topic, practically the same email, come to me from a commercial radio show in Kitchener, where the radio host had obviously really made up his mind about this idea, and this was a bad idea as far as he was concerned. And it was a completely different conversation, whereas same kind of thing, when you're on the radio, you don't know who's out there. You know where they live, kind of, and that's about it. But and even now with radio being on, you can get it on the internet, so you actually don't know where the people are who might be listening to you. And I thought, you never know who's listening to you. But this person obviously had a certain idea about who his audience was, and he was assuming, I think, that they had the same ideas and the same values that he did, and so he was very comfortable asserting himself as, I think I can say, a conservative who didn't like this idea, and I was just sort of, I found myself having to try to pull the ground back so that I wasn't kind of sucked into, what the overall, institutional cultural value structure was. And so it's interesting, because it was the exact same topic. They were within 24 hours of each other, but completely different experience for me. And I also find a big difference between writing in print, for a print newspaper that's going to land on your doorstep in the morning, versus writing for the exact same newspaper online. Because when you write for print, it goes out there, and you might get a couple of emails from people who take the time to look you up and want to ask you something or comment on something. But if you write something online, it's like it's immediately live. And for better or for worse, you do end up with a lot of comments about what you've written. And so it's a whole day project. If I find publishing something online, that takes my whole day, because people will tweet and email and everything all day. But putting it in print is like you kind of, it's over by 10 a.m.
Oh, you make me sound so old-fashioned, because I don't do social media. I don't have a Facebook page. And yeah, so it's kind of interesting. And I cannot start my day without reading the Globe and Mail. I grew up in a household, although it was low, middle class, working class, we had 4 newspapers a day because that's how you learned about the differences, the different ways of engaging with social and political events. So I'm very old-fashioned in that way. But I was on a talk show on radio, CBC, and it was a fascinating experience because some of the people wrote to the show and then they forwarded the email, so I had very engaging conversations with some of them. It's a very interesting experience. But the interesting thing for me is that I guess it depends on how you position yourself. If you are an academic, in my experience, the kind of academic I am, with hardly any presence in the social media or Google, you somehow seem to be, you are rendered invisible. So, I mean, yes, the social media and the internet are extremely important, but I don't think they're for everyone. Yeah.
I'm all about the output. I'm not about getting feedback. I'm all about, frankly,
Feedback can be rough.
I was raised that way. This isn't a discussion. This isn't a committee. We are not interested in knowing whether or not you love those boots so much, they have holes in them. You're not wearing them. I very much view my contribution to social media and the media as a one-way street because I do not want opinions of people who don't know me telling me things and commenting on things that I haven't even mentioned. And we're not going to enter into a dialogue if we're not mutually invested in each other. And what I put out as a musician or as a public figure or as a public intellectual is simply the snapshot of what was happening then. And I have always put out the disclaimer that I know nothing and that I enjoy what I do and I hope that you can gravitate towards me, but there is a very clear distinction between the public for me and the people who are closest to me, which is not the public, right? I mean, my parents are not the public. My husband is not the public. And I have the same people closest to me from high school. I sometimes add and sometimes subtract. But I think it's very important that your immediate public, be amongst the people that you trust the absolute most, because then your output will always be motivated by something genuine. And your people will tell you. Your people will tell you. My people are telling me I have to go.
I was just going to say, I actually have
I know.
two public
I'm so
service
sorry.
announcements. Can we briefly take a pause and thank Misha so much for joining us?
Pleasure to meet you.
So that as we're reorganizing ourselves up here, the second of the public service announcements is that it's 3:45, so I'm going to pose one more question to Laurie and Smarrow, and then I'm going to open things up to all of you to come up. And so this is going to give you a few minutes to gather your thoughts, line up in teeming arrays of people by the microphones, and prepare yourself to pose questions to our generous speakers. First, though, the last question that I am going to allow myself to ask you all before we hand things over to the audience is a question about knowledge transfer. So each of you, and it's unfair to speak to Misha, who is now gone, but each of you, and she was the last to do it, spoke a little bit about knowledge transfer and knowledge exchange. And so I have a question around intergenerational mentorship, specifically in terms of mentoring women and being mentored. I'm thinking specifically here of lateral forms of mentorship, not simply top-down, I shall fill my students with the knowledge that I have, or some other egregious phrasing that might happen, Rather, I'm interested in asking you all to speak to the audience about whether or not you have mentors who have encouraged you to think through publics, through communities, through citizenships, to write and speak to those topics or in those spaces. And if so, if you'd be willing to share with us the ways in which they mentored you, some advice perhaps to audience members who are interested in thinking through and thinking with communities and publics, and yet are aware of the different kinds of, to pick up on last panel, risks that might be involved in that. Thinking about mentorship. Lori?
Yeah, that's an interesting concept to me because I had a conversation the other day about the concept of apprenticeship and whether we really still do that anymore. I know that's not what you're asking. You're not asking the kind of, top-down, one-directional kind of mentorship. But I think, you always get inspired by people who you think are doing the right thing. And it seems to me that I always was I was the same, I'd read 4 papers in the morning kind of thing. And so I always wanted to be saying something that kind of mattered to people and that would help people do what they wanted to do. And so I immediately gravitated toward teaching and having students and being a professor and that sort of thing. But it wasn't too long afterward that I wanted to talk to other people as well. And so it wasn't too long after I started at Dalhousie that I did radio shows, I did newspaper things, I did citizen group things, and I really enjoyed that, and I really found that to be very rewarding. When I started at Dalhousie, I had been a PhD student there, and everybody in the department kind of went from being my professor to being my colleague overnight. And so I really was in a very fortunate situation because everyone in the department had kind of overseen my transition from being a graduate student who really didn't know anything to being someone who was now had an office of her own kind of thing and had students of her own. And so I think I've been very fortunate to have a kind of collective mentorship where everyone sort of took responsibility for everyone.
Thank you.
I don't know why I'm finding so hard to answer this question.
No, this question is the hardest.
Yeah. I was thinking about it when you sent us the questions a few weeks ago. And the first thing that came to mind was actually echoed through the discourse, the vocabulary introduced in the earlier session, the notion of risk and passion. I would say I was encouraged by my father, who was not educated, but he was a major union leader of a major union, railway employees in Greece. And he was the leader during, or the president during the military regime. And he was not very educated, I had to correct his speeches. So he would give me a speech. I was a high school kid, but a good student, so I would correct his grammar. And then I would see him deliver the speeches, and then I would see the risk that public delivery would put him into, and the whole family, because of the military regime situation. So I learned that it's incredibly energizing, it's a thrill, it's a commitment. You do it out of a sense of citizenship, but it also comes with a lot of risks. And you have to balance your responsibility towards the public and towards your family. And my dad did not know how to do that. So that was one form of inspiration or mentorship, if you want. And I guess I had a university professor in Greece when I was an undergraduate who encouraged me to pursue things. And then the mentorship situation I can think of has to do with New West